All right. Can you see that?
Looking good.
All right. So nominally, I'm going to talk about working with OpenAI APIs in Elixir, but I'm going to do a little bit of an intro about LLMs and why we might want to use them. Um, the one interesting way to think about LLMs is imagine that you had a magical function that took a string, any string, uh, in a language and returned another string. And imagine what you could do with that. Large language models are effectively that. They take a couple of options and maybe some composition of strings, but largely they're taking a string as an input and giving you a string, a complex string as an output, which is pretty cool. I was originally a little bit skeptical about LLMs. I still am slightly, but I think lately I've been diving into the rabbit hole and yeah, I look at it as sort of neither a useless tool or the most useful tool ever, or it's not AGI yet, but it is still quite useful. And I think I've seen people be quite skeptical, and we're right to be skeptical, but it's still potentially quite useful. And I think we can look at ways to use these tools in our programs as well. One way I've thought about it is think of it as a way to natural language query into effectively a knowledge base of all of the training data that has been scraped off the internet and gathered elsewhere, and effectively gives you custom generated textual answers. Um, you know, it's sort of in my mind replacing Google as a knowledge index in a way for sort of at least programming workflows and knowledge and question and answer workflows as well. I think it's useful to talk about what kind of use cases can we, leverage LLMs for in our apps to solve what are effectively traditionally hard problems. Producing human-like text on literally any topic they've been trained on is pretty useful. Translation, some of the models are really quite good at languages. We'll talk about the latest models. But yeah, translation is basically a solved problem. Often in global SaaS applications, we're trying to build translations and we can do some of those automatically. It may need review from real users to get it exactly right, but I think you can solve a lot of those kind of problems. Interestingly, Zach, one of our colleagues, has used it as a Japanese language training tool. So getting it to, work with you on practicing a language, certainly a really good idea. I'm about to get my daughter, who's 12, learning French, to try practicing French with ChatGPT 4.0, which is a multimodal model that can talk to you in French, and sort of keep the level at a reasonable conversational level. So I'm going to try that out fairly soon. Summarizing content is, an absolute sweet spot for LLMs. Taking a large complex document, I've thrown in some legal things to just get a summary of it, so I don't have to read all of the nitty gritty, and sort of get it to highlight some of the key cases, some of the interesting parts that might be worth considering, some of the risks, some of the wordier parts. That's been really useful. It doesn't replace reading the actual document, but if you need a quick summary of something, that's really, really useful. Content rewriting, so taking a bit of content and then rephrasing it or rewriting that's pretty useful. It's also surprisingly good at classification and categorization. Just taking a bunch of content, categorizing it into some kind of set of categories, or letting it just do its own thing and coming up with new categories. It may be a little bit creative about those. But also we've been writing some chatbots recently, and I've given it a JSON product catalog, and it's been able to, even without too much prompting, recommend things that are pretty reasonable recommendations within that catalog. I believe it's been trained on some of the data it was actually working with, but yeah, giving it a JSON catalog, even with just short descriptions and without actual categorization tags, it was pretty decent at doing that. Analyzing sentiment. So if you wanted to take some text, user text, and figure out whether it's good or bad, what the tone is, that's pretty useful. And building, effectively chatbots, conversational AIs, allowing sort of more natural interactions with your application. Certainly something that I think can be an adjunct to and potentially in the future replace existing AIs, UIs. So I think of this as a way to, if you think about your applications, did the user ever ask for dashboards or reports? I mean, they probably did, but what do they really want to solve with doing that? It's typically they wanted answers to questions or information about a thing. And you could argue that, they didn't really ask for apps either. What they really wanted to do was interact with the system and make stuff happen. And we could probably do that sometimes more effectively with a natural language interface. What are the challenges? Non-determinism was a big thing that sort of kept me wondering, how is this useful? Until I discovered the temperature gauge, which you can turn the temperature right down, and it becomes not completely deterministic, but a lot less random and wacky. So what the temperature gauge does is effectively, reduce the amount of randomness about how it selects the next word. It's not always right, and you should always be skeptical about what output it is. Different models have different sweet spots. You definitely want to be testing that out and testing, if you're going to ship LLM usage to production, you want to make sure your use cases are really well tested. And that really isn't a thing that is well published and well known. So certainly be writing tests around what you expect your models to be doing, because they can change underneath you, and you want to make sure that if you're changing a prompt, that it doesn't regress in some way that you didn't expect. Safety is a big issue. It's certainly been, a thing that the big LLM proprietary producers have been focusing on. OpenAI, it's debatable how much they care about safety, but certainly they've made ChatGPT 4.0 much more safe than it has been. People have been, really trying to hack it. They've closed a lot of the cases that they've found, and it's hard to get it off task and to get it to do something really wild. But it's certainly still a concern. I did see this afternoon, as I was sort of reading through Anthropic's website, because I hadn't used Claude until last week. It is really quite good, and their whole company policy on just safety concerns is really built into their mission. Cost is something that you need to think about. Chris was talking about open models that you can run yourself. Obviously, that has a cost when you run them on GPUs, but the commercial models are pretty expensive. They're not that cheap, so you've got to think about, well, how many tokens is this producing? A lot of the models I've used tend to be quite verbose by default. You can tune that, but you've got to be thinking about how many tokens is this using on the inputs and the outputs. So yeah, like I said, the latest models, they're getting better really, really fast. It's been sort of 2 years since ChatGPT 3 was launched, which was really the opening door to LLMs being termed AI and being the next great thing. Let's look at some of the capabilities. So ChatGPT 4.0, has everyone played with that yet? Yeah, not everyone has. If you haven't played with it, it only got released in May, so it's been maybe a month, 5 weeks or so. It is worth playing with. It really did represent to me like a level where this is actually really quite good now. The O on 4.0 is for Omni. It's not 4.0 as some people might think it is. And it is a multimodal interface. So if you install the app on your phone, I think you do have to pay for it. I'm not sure if there's a free tier, but you can basically interact with it directly with the model, with text, audio. I haven't used the video or the image stuff, but the audio is pretty good. You can just talk to it. It makes Siri look really silly. And it's really natural to talk to it. It talks back to you, but it's also writing out the text as well. So if you don't want to wait to hear it all and you can read faster, you can sort of interact with it in multiple ways. Now, what that does replace was a chain of, you might talk to it or provide some video, and then it turned that into text, and then it fed it into the ChatGPT 4 model, which was textual, and then did the same on the other side. This is direct in and direct out. I think the other thing to consider is also just how much context the new models have. 128,000 tokens is a lot. It's approximately 3 to 4 tokens per word, roughly. And that covers the sort of the inputs and the outputs, which they do tend to charge slightly differently. Look, this is pretty expensive. 1 million tokens, that's 250,000 words. It's not a lot, but for what it's doing, it's pretty good. But remember, it's fairly verbose by default as well. Has everyone heard of Claude 3.5 Sonnet? Because that got released last week. I'm getting one nod. But if you haven't checked this out, I'll do a demo. It is quite amazing. I haven't played with it too much, but I've done a little bit of stuff, and it's really quite good at coding. And it has a experimental feature called artifacts, which allows you to run code and do stuff on the side, diagrams, that kind of thing. So we can have a look at that at the end. Compared to 4.0, it's really, really fast, like surprisingly fast. It doesn't feel like you're waiting for each word to come out like 4.0, so that's quite good. I've got it to do, one-shot coding tasks. It can build websites. It can build React apps. It does do some Elixir, but it's not as good as things that have been, trained on with more training data. So, and just the text that it produces sounds a little bit more natural to me than ChatGPT, but that's, debatable depending on how you interpret it. Like I said, the whole company has a real focus on safety and privacy. They claim to have never have trained on any private data that wasn't explicitly given. So that's worth considering. Certainly, OpenAI's sort of view on safety is potentially dubious. And so I think, looking at Claude and Anthropic and how they view that is it's quite in the forefront, which is definitely worth thinking about when you're talking about giving it, potentially private data. I found out today that 200,000 tokens of context, again, that's a lot. You can really stick a lot of context in there. You can think of that as like, well, how big can I make my prompt before it sort of starts hallucinating? It seems to be relatively similarly priced, but slightly cheaper on the input tokens than ChatGPT. This is a Hugging Face leaderboard table. I think the thing to note is that ChatGPT 4.0 has led the way for quite a while, but Claude Sonnet definitely has caught up. I've got a graph in a second, but this is a way to look at, how do the models compare? You can see that all of these best ones are proprietary. But obviously, if you can find a small task for open models, you can certainly, use those. So this is sort of a sense of how quickly things have moved in the last sort of year and a half. Claude wasn't even really released until April last year. So it's only been around a year, and it seems to have already surpassed GPT 4.0. So I think this is a interesting sense of just how quickly things are moving. And so, playing with the different models is definitely something to be looking at. So OpenAI's and their APIs. What I'm going to go through is the completions API, which is pretty simple and it's pretty standard. And we'll see how we can use that. And I'm going to do a quick demo of the assistance API as well. The difference with assistance API is that it's a threaded model and you can apply multiple assistants to one conversation. So the API is a little bit more involved, but it's still relatively simple, but it's much more capable, and you can keep a conversation going It's great for writing chatbots. And in terms of Elixir client options, OpenAI X is the one I first reached for, and it's pretty good. I think, there's a sort of feeling in the sort of Elixir community that, yeah, we've got all of these API clients and they often don't add that much value. So we've got, lots of different AWS clients, for example, some of the handwritten, some of the generated from the API docs. But often if you don't need everything rec, which if you haven't used, you should use, and this is definitely an advertisement for rec, we'll see it in the demo. It is really simple and really easy to just, effectively write something that looks like a curl statement and just choose the bits that you want. Cool. All right, let's have a look at a demo. So what I'm going to show you first, if I can wrangle my window, is the OpenAI playground. You can find this at platform OpenAI. And it's a little bit hidden, but certainly go check it out if you haven't. It's quite useful. So this is the playground. We're going into the chat API here, or at least an interface to the chat API. The completions API down here is legacy. So that is basically deprecated. This is the new one. So you can enter system instructions here. I'm just going to do a very simple one. So that's effectively the system prompt. And then we can go, right, about Elixir. So we can have sort of, more standard things. It's really, I don't think, any different from just giving it one big prompt, but you can sort of, give it multiple user messages per system prompt. So we didn't tell it what kind of poem to write, so it did decide to write quite a long one. But not bad. Let me just move this bit of Chrome around. Can you still see you can't see my Zoom bit, can you?
No, we've just got your Chrome window.
Yeah, cool. That's good to know. So the thing to note here, and this was the big sort of highlight for me about just being able to determine what the determinism level is. If we turn that temperature right down to 0 and the default is 1, it gets a lot less creative and basically makes it just choose the top choice of the next word. And so that makes it much more predictable. It's still going to be different and it's still going to be random. But we can, all right, poem, let's say a short poem. Let's do the same thing and just see what the temperature gauge changed. So, what you'll find with a lower temperature is you'll get, similar results. Not exactly the same, but it'll be less creative effectively. And that's good to know if you're getting sort of interesting things. And it really depends on your task. If you want it to do really creative writing, you might want to turn that up. My default has been to turn that way down because usually I want things to be more predictable. You've got some parameters here, max tokens. It's sort of, limiting the number of tokens. So if you really want short responses and you want to limit your costs, that's something to think about. Top P is the other way to reduce randomness. This effectively reduces the pool of options down to just the top one, basically. I haven't played with that, but apparently you should either change temperature or top P and not both. There's a couple of options about just repetitiveness. I haven't played with those yet. So yeah, that's basically the chat API, or what's called completions. The other API is assistance. So this allows you to create, effectively a chatbot or an assistant, as they call it. You can give it a name, you can give it a whole bunch of instructions, and then you can have conversations with it. So this is quite a long prompt. I was trying to get it to produce effectively, live view applications as Phoenix Playground. Probably not going to have time to show you that, but Phoenix Playground is a pretty cool way of doing effectively one file live view friendly Phoenix apps, which is really cool because you can see just how simple, Phoenix and live view is in a one file wonder. So yeah, I've had to prompt it to say, hey, use Tailwind for styling, separate application logic from UI code, because it tends to jam it together if you don't tell it that. I had a few other things that I wanted to do, get it to generate documentation. So we can try this out. I wasn't having much luck because I think it was using various conversations that I already had, but we can maybe get it to write something. Let's see if it does it. So what it's doing is taking all of these instructions and we can have a conversation about it. And it seems to be doing a reasonable job. So, all right. So what it's done is, if you haven't seen Phoenix Playground, it's worth checking out. You can basically just, do a one file. So it's done a calculated live, it's got a mount, it's got different operands in there and an operator. It's got a UI, it's using Tailwind like I told it to. This is the sneaky way to use Tailwind. Otherwise it's, you need an install of a thing. So that's the cheats way of doing it. I can't scroll to the right for some reason, but it looks like a reasonable thing. So we've got updates for each of the things, operators, operands, and a calculate function using floats. Not terrible. And we should be able to chuck that in a live book and see if it works. I might do that at the end if we've got time. So I can keep having conversations with it. I can probably get it to basically refactor. Hasn't followed my instructions on splitting out the logic. So let's get it to try and do that. So the main difference with assistants, like I already mentioned, is you're keeping a thread of a conversation, which is effectively all it's doing is composing, completions, AIs, and re-giving the prompt and the conversation back to get the next thing. But it is keeping state about your conversation, which is cool. So now it's split that out and it's done a reasonable refactor, split out the calculator module, documented it, and given us a calculate function. So not too bad. Proof is in the pudding. I wouldn't expect anything that isn't simple to work first time, but it's going to have a reasonable shot at it and, expect to be having a conversation about the code. So it's not taking your jobs just yet. So that's the assistant API. Again, some of the parameters are which model are you choosing? I'm just defaulting to the best model until, you want to be cheaper. Some other things to note that I'm not going to go into, but we can create a file search. You can give it, documents, PDFs, catalogs of stuff, and it basically creates a vector store that the assistant will determine, do I need to call out and search in the file? It'll figure out based on the name and the contents whether it needs to call that, and it will call it for you. Code interpreter is to get it to run code. I haven't played with that at all, so I can't talk to that. The other thing that is interesting is you can get it to call functions. Now, for the longest time, I couldn't figure out, well, how does it know what to call? But what it does is it effectively gives you describe a function, you describe the arguments as a JSON structure. And when it determines that it needs to call that function, let's say it's the weather, you actually just have to read, oh, it needs function call. You read what the parameters were, and then you go and make the call yourself. So you actually have to read the response, determine that you make the call, go get the call and put the response back into the conversation. So that is definitely interesting when you wanted to do some interaction and custom stuff. It knows when to call those tools, and it's pretty good about doing that. You can also make it, instead of returning natural text, return structured JSON objects. So we saw instructor, Uh, I've got to say this may have been for other models more needed, but when I've asked it to produce structured output, it's done a pretty good job. If you don't tell it what structure to give you, it will tend to make stuff up, but it's pretty good at extracting structured information out. Again, I've just been using 4.0. I haven't used the other models, so you probably need that for lesser models. Structured output, pretty useful. And again, you've got the temperature and top P for reducing creativity. All right, so how do we use that from Elixir? So that is an API that we can go and use. Let me just get this stuff out of the way. All right, so this is what we need for doing this. We're just going to use rec and JSON here. I was playing around with Phoenix Playground, but we may have time to drop that one in. Rec is pretty good. If you need an HTTP client, there are a lot of choices. Rec is now just my go-to. It is really simple and it's very flexible. So all we're doing is setting a base URL, which if you wanted to call other OpenAI compatible APIs, you can use that. We get our API key in there, and then we can use rec.post, pass in that context, and then we are using the chat completions here. I've got a chat GPT 3.5 Turbo, and all I do is give it a message, give it the role that that message is from, and tell it to do stuff. So this is the response we get back, and we can see that that is the haiku that we got. And this is probably a, very good model to say, hey, turn the temperature up. Probably already is 1, but this is where we would set the temperature to 1. I think that is the right thing. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, a beautiful haiku. So that's pretty simple. And honestly, if that's all you take away from this, is that really it is going back to that magical function. Yeah, there are a couple of other parameters, choosing the model, setting temperatures and so forth. But really all you're doing is giving it a string and getting a string back, which is pretty cool. And I think, use your imagination as to how you might want to utilize that in your apps. But, traditionally that was very hard to do, and now it's extremely simple. So what else can we do? Remember I showed you a system prompt and a user prompt. This is a slightly more expanded example, but that's about as complicated as this gets, really. So you're a famous Japanese poet, like Japanese Gandalf called Mr. Miyagi. I'm getting it to return a structured list of lines. Now, remember, I haven't told it to be structured. I've just asked it to be. So I haven't set that parameter. And what it is doing is actually returning it in the string as JSON line by line. So not too bad. It's actually 4.0 is surprisingly good at returning structured data. So if it absolutely has to be structured and you don't have to tell it, yeah, flick that switch. But otherwise, it's pretty decent. And I think, yeah, maybe we could tell it. I don't know what the API parameter is, but I'd imagine that you'd get something that you didn't have to unpick from a string as the structured output. So it would be directly JSON that you could just pass to a JSON parser. All right, so what if it takes a while? I think you noticed that it, did chug through producing the output, and it does take a while. So let's see what happens with the streaming API. So all I've done is set stream to true, and rec handles streaming really elegantly. What it's doing is producing server sent events, which took me a while to figure out what this data was, but that is the server sent event protocol. It's just a string with data column and a JSON blob in there. So you can unpack that. And what it's doing is giving you effectively token by token, I think. Yeah, these are each token. And what you can do is effectively pile it into a, UI or a string or what have you. And you can get it to basically show you what it's doing as it's going. So that's pretty cool. Rec streaming is good. And, if you want to show your user the results instead of waiting a couple of seconds for long answers, that's how to do it. All right. So that was the completions API. It's really quite simple. There's not a lot to it. Rec makes it pretty simple to interact with as well. When I have used OpenAI EX, but it doesn't really add a lot of value, to be honest. The only thing that it really does for you is sort of add required headers for the thing, which isn't that hard to put in yourself, to be honest. We could add that to the rec, but I was doing it for both. So yeah, look, rec's pretty handy. And I think there's been quite a few articles that I read in the last week or two that are saying, do we really need to have HTTP clients, for every single, HTTP API? And I think the answer is, well, rec's pretty good and you don't really. Sometimes it's useful, but yeah, check out rec. It's pretty powerful. All right, so this is the assistance API. This is where we create an assistant. We've told it you're a maths tutor, do some stuff. Great. Now, the assistant API is a little bit more involved. You have to create a thread that you're going to put all the conversations into. The reason for that is that you can have multiple assistants per thread or per conversation. I haven't tried doing that. I don't know what that looks like, but you can imagine a series of different kinds of assistants applying different kinds of inputs, all working off the same context in the thread. So pretty useful stuff, keeps them pretty stateful. Here's where we create a thread to put all of our conversation into. Then what we do is we explicitly add to that thread, and we captured the ID here, and we just send it to post to that endpoint. Here's the user prompt, solve the equation. Great, we get the messages back that we're putting in there. We can add files and so forth, and that all gets added to the context. And then once we've done all of that, we can connect the assistant that we have, and we only have one. We add the assistant into the thread and tell it a prompt. So we've said, yeah, call the user Jane Doe. They've got a premium account. And then that isn't the end. Hang on. Is this doing a run? Yeah, this creates the run that actually goes and does stuff. Now there's two options. Again, you can either wait and poll for the response to see whether it's done or not, or you can just stream like we saw before. I don't have that example here, but this is effectively the polling thing where we just ask for the messages that happened. And we can see that first message, which is at the end, is the user prompt. And then this one is the whole output. So this is where we grab that output. And, this is how to navigate our data structure. And then we can put out what the answer was. So it's actually pretty good at using sort of math context. So if that was converted to HTML, I think that would just look mathy, like sort of math markup. And so, yeah, got a solution to that equation using algebra. I haven't checked it, but it looks.
I think that's great.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know whether you can use markdown to HTML to get that. But yeah, it looks pretty good in the output. So yeah, that's pretty much it from the API front. Any questions on that so far? It's a good question. I don't know. I don't think so, because it really is just about how it's choosing the next word and what pool of tokens, probabilistically is it choosing it from. And that doesn't change the output in terms of volume. So I don't think so. All right. So what else do we have? Oh yeah, Open Router. I discovered this from someone's talk the other week, and this is pretty cool. It's effectively an OpenAI compatible API tool and UI, and you can try a lot of models all at the same time, which is extremely useful when you want to find the model for the purpose that you're trying to use it for. yeah, basically, if you wanted to find the cheapest model that does a good job on your task, it's pretty good for that. And we can also, if you've been using proprietary models and you want to switch to an open model that you can run locally, it's another good way to find something that would be on Hugging Face. Let me just make this full screen again. So this is what the Open Router UI looks like. Check it out. It's really quite good. You can load up all the models here. You need API keys for the proprietary models. But yeah, all the open models are there and it just pulls them off Hugging Face, I believe. But yeah, definitely check that out. That's an example of just getting lots of outputs from the same thing. And you can also, they're all streaming, so you can see how fast they are as well. It tells you the end timings, at least for the first one. I don't know why it isn't. And it tells you the tokens as well. But yeah, I'm not sure why it's not giving timings for the other ones, but you can actually see it as it streams through how fast it is. So you can get a visceral sense. And yeah, like I said, this is an OpenAI compatible API. So all of the stuff that we just saw with Rec, it's exactly the same. And you just get a wider variety of models and a different base URL. So yeah, check that out. So the future, probably a discussion point because I'm getting close to time, but yeah, what happens to programming? It's an open question. Our jobs are pretty safe so far. This is really just a textual index tool that's really good at language manipulation. But it's, it's not perfect, but it's good at quite a lot of tasks, and the number of tasks it's better at is changing rapidly. So that graph, it doesn't give you a sense of the sort of exponential stuff that's happening. So yeah, and I think this sort of changes how we look at building applications as well. Like AI needs data and it needs a lot of it. I mean, that's different if you've already got pre-trained LLMs, but if you're training your own models, it needs a hell of a lot of data. So yeah, like Chris said, probably want to just use models that already exist if they do, because it takes a lot of time and money to build them. The data has to be really accurate and well structured, and yeah, garbage in, garbage out. And really, if we want to replace, various UI components with natural language interfaces, then we need platforms with good APIs, both internal and external, so you can plug in a new UI. If you've mixed your concerns, your business logic sitting in your UI, well, then you're going to have problems. So that's something worth thinking about. And I think, yeah, I probably talked about this earlier. It's like AI is the new UI. I think we'll see this happening over the next few years. Yeah, that's it for now. Questions? It is, yeah. So really that was just a UI. So the question was, is the files and the functions capabilities available in the API? And I believe it is. So yeah. Yeah, it basically is like the file search. When you add a file, it'll create a vector compression, a vector embedding of that. I don't know what it actually looks like, but it, it creates a vector embedding that it knows about the contents and the name of the file, and then it can figure out when it needs to call into that and then call into it. So it's kind of like a RAG, yeah. Yep. So you give it the file, and if you need it to get correct data out of that file, you can basically do that. So it's kind of like a RAG, yeah. There is fine-tuning capabilities in that playground. You can go and fine-tune your own model. I haven't looked at that, but it's a thing. There's also a whole batch interface that's half the price if you do it at, in a big batch at midnight, or let them schedule it when they're not busy. Any other questions online, Mike?
Not yet.
All right. If we have
Okay.
a little bit of time, which I think we have a couple of minutes, I want to show you.
Here we go. One more from Adam. Rec is fast. OpenAI responses are slow. How have you handled either many small recs or very large single contexts with AI?
What do we mean by Rex?
many, I guess, requests.
Ah, right. And what was the last bit of the question? How have we handled?
Yeah, having many small requests or very large single contexts.
So yeah, with the large context, you've got to think about what the model is capable of keeping, because once I've exceeded the context and it starts getting hallucinatory and doing things sort of off piece. So once you build up a really big context, you've got to think about, am I exceeding the context? Is it still able to see its original instructions, or is it just making stuff up? And that's something I haven't experienced too much, but I've certainly seen it when we busted out of the context. I think probably want to just show you Claude Sonnet and example. Oh, sure. I mean, go nuts, go play around with them. I mean, it's really pretty simple. You can tell it what to do and it will largely do it. Summarizing stuff. I mean, play around with the tools. They're out there. There are free tiers. Definitely check it out. But I will suggest that, yeah, Claude Sonnet is pretty incredible, and it has exceeded my wildest dreams about what a LLM can do. So yeah, I've asked it to basically, this is the prompt, build a Wordle clone in React. And it has a thing called the artifact tool, which is basically, I've gone through a bunch of iterations here. And it took about it made a reasonable working Wordle clone to start. So we can see that, but it ended up building Wordle in React with all of the features that I wanted. It didn't have the keyboard to start. It was pretty simple to start with. So I've sort of made it do more, I think. It's only got limited words in its dictionary, so it's not the perfect thing. But yeah, it does. The logic wasn't perfect as well, so I had to get it to do stuff. But, being able to do one-shot apps, simple apps, and then run them is a pretty powerful tool. And you can see the code over here. It's reasonable code. Again, don't trust it. It's not guaranteed to be correct, but it's doing a pretty reasonable job of creating, an app as you expected it to be, using components, I think from Shad CDN, I believe. But yeah, so, I went through a few versions of this, got it to add the keyboard, the letters colored, made sure that it checked for valid words, and so it created a dictionary. And yeah, look, it deals with this stuff pretty well. But I think the thing to remember is that where you're hitting its training data, it's going to do really well. And where you're not hitting its training data, it's going to do less well. So if there's lots of great training data, you're going to get good results. And if there isn't, you're going to get less good results. But it still can program Elixir. We saw the thing there. I'll have to check later if it's actually a valid program, but it looked pretty reasonable. But this workflow of doing refactoring and getting it to fix errors, it's not bad. So it had some larger words in the dictionary to start with, so I made it fix that. And yeah, it came up with a pretty good result. So definitely urge you to play with Claude 3.5 Sonnet. It is quite excellent. And this whole artifacts thing, which you do have to turn on, is pretty nice. I think that's all we've got time for.